Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to have here in our institute
I come back.
Professor Vaclav Janeček, who is professor of law at the University of Bristol Law School. He will spend his sabbatical here in our institute, and we are very happy about it. He's particularly expert in legal implication of AI or the interaction between AI and law. So this is the first event of this series of seminars. We have called this series IGSG dialogues, and we hope that other seminars will be organized in this period. So we are very pleased that this morning also Professor Domenico Siciliano, is philosopher of law, is here, and he will be a discussant in this seminar. So Professor Vaclav Janeček will speak about probabilistic legal interpretation, and I give him the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Enrico, and thank you everyone for coming today and for your interest in this topic. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to give a fairly high-level overview of the project on which I'm working and will be working over the next many months during my stay here at the Institute. And it is a project that brings together various angles ranging from philosophy of law, which is why I'm very pleased to have Professor Siciliano here, also to traditional legal mathematics, computer science, linguistics, as well as very traditional legal methods on doctrinal law as well. So it's a broad overview that what you're going to see, and I'm hoping that this will give you a better idea as to how we might engage on the project and on the topic going forward. So here we go. Probabilistic legal interpretation. I should upfront acknowledge the funding I received for this project by the Leverhulme Trust. So that is something I must not forget. So before I lose everyone's full attention, I want to just start with the key message. So the key message for the project and for this talk is that generative AI and large language models can be helpful in legal research, but that it is a fallacy to assume that AI systems or AI agents today can, in the strong sense of the word, can engage in legal interpretation of the legal data. So there's one part of the key message, and the other part is that said, I am increasingly becoming to believe that such AI system can still be leveraged for interpretive insights about the law's content, provided that we specify and mechanistically interpret the inner workings of the AI system as an exercise in what I call probabilistic interpretation. And I will explain in more detail what that means, but the key here is this mechanistic interpretability approach, and that if we understand what's going on under the hood as probabilistic interpretation, then I would say that it still makes sense to understand what's going on as a kind of interpretive task, but it's something different to legal interpretation in the traditional sense. And so that's the key message here. So to start with, and I'm actually quite fortunate that not that long ago, colleagues in the US have published a piece of research that sits quite squarely with what I'm focusing on, and this was on the recommended reading list prior to the seminar. So those of you who have had the opportunity to have a look at that piece will know that there is already a burgeoning research in that area, and that there is a series of scholars as well as practitioners, judges, who are trying to propose something that Professor Grimmerman and others call generative interpretation or generative misinterpretation, to be more precise there. But the idea is that there is a range of experiments out there that people are using large language models to effectively try answer interpretive questions about the law. And these experimentators, they would argue that it's actually very successful in doing so. So that is the starting point, that there is now an increasing trend, and we observe that this is being used in interpretive legal tasks, generative AI systems. Now, just to start with, and I'm sure everyone in the room is already on the same page, but just to make sure, so I start with the assumption here that when we talk about generative AI systems, and when we talk about the task of legal interpretation, we need to be precise as to the level of abstraction at which we are discussing this. So we can be talking at a very technical level, we can be talking in sociological terms, etc., etc. So one thing I want to throw out there for the start is that I don't think there is a clear match between how we as lawyers, now I'm counting myself to the camp of lawyers, how we as lawyers think about the art or craft of legal interpretation and what's going on, and how we think about the craft of generative interpretation or misinterpretation when it's being conducted by AI agents. Why? Well, when we talk about AI agents, the conceptual framework we have is that agents can be defined traditionally in computer science terms as effectively entities, computational entities that meet these three conditions: that they can sense the environment, that they can somehow interact with the environment with the data, that they can autonomously plan some steps, and that they have the tools to execute them. Now, you can already see that this is fairly generic description of what's going on, but let's stick with it so far. Whereas when we talk about legal interpretation, as lawyers, we think about completely different kinds of activities. We talk about the spotting of the legal issue, planning data search, finding and accessing the legal data, reading and interpreting the data, and forming actionable conclusions from the interpreted data, typically with some aim of specifying the rule applicable to the issue, or reframing the issue, or advancing the research question in the first instance. Now, that's just for a little bit of background. I will return to this distinction in a minute. But at this point, I want you to entertain a quick thought experiment. Now, imagine this AI agent that can plan and execute these steps by accessing environment. Imagine an AI agent that is tasked with conducting research, legal research on, say, administrative forms and laws for migrants in Italy. There is an intentional reference to an ongoing project here. Leveraging, for instance, chatbots in order to query the EURLEX database, or another intentional reference to the ongoing project here, and to carry out some autonomous research about those legal rules for migrants. And so when prompted, the agent would then interpret or we would say that the agent would interpret the researched laws, generating an answer as to what the relevant legal texts mean. Now, I just want you simply to imagine this scenario, acknowledging that this is not a fully worked out experiment in terms of that I need to give you more details, because we do not know what the interim steps would involve. There may be some chain of thought reasoning, there may be a neuro-symbolic AI under the hood, there may be a whole amalgam of parts, components in the system, but that is not important for the argument that I'm going to make here. It's just the idea that we delegate the task of legal research to something we may call an AI agent, and that the output of that legal research would be something that we perceive to be something like an interpretation of the source material which the AI system can access. Yeah, so just imagine that scenario. And now, when we try, or when I try as part of the project, when I try to make sense of this from the computer science conceptualization or generic conceptualization of AI agents and what we think about in terms of legal research, so we can start trying to map the sensing of the environment to perhaps the spotting of the legal issue in legal research or the finding and accessing legal data. Or we can try to map the planning steps in the AI agent's capabilities with the planning of the data search and reading and interpreting the data or forming the conclusions from the interpreted data. And when we talk about the execution, it may be the last step, but so far, this is not something that we find in the literature, this attempt to try merge these two or map these two conceptualizations one on another. And from what I've been trying to do so far, I can't really see how that can actually be successfully mapped one onto another. And so one interim message here is that this is not a very useful exercise. So as researchers, we just discover what we discover. So an interim result there is that this mapping really doesn't help us, and just at simply a conceptual level, trying to argue that AI agents can engage in legal interpretation would require us actually to be able to do this mapping, which we cannot, not least because we do not know what is specifically involved in those individual steps. And so one reason why that might be is something that's been described quite broadly in the literature already, and so that is this clash of paradigms we have when we talk about generative AI systems, or more broadly about data-driven AI systems, and how they process data versus how lawyers process data when they engage with what we may call jurisprudential tasks, such as legal interpretation. So this has been described in the literature as the distinction between the distant and close reading of the text, or more recently between the distant writing and close writing of the legal text, or as I have written about this a couple of years ago, the distinction between the processing of legal data in the jurisprudential sense and processing of legal data as bulk data. So it's a categorically different kind of exercise when we look at the processing and the interpretation, possibly interpretation of legal data as bulk data processing, versus when we as doctrinal lawyers go and read the data closely and interpret them as jurisprudential categories. So that may be one fundamental source of the impossibility of mapping the two onto each other. But this doesn't take away the question that if we are using, and this is already observed in legal and judicial practice, if we are using some of these tools to discharge interpretive tasks, so how do we interpret these assumed interpretations? And here I'm talking in the computer science sense of the word interpretation. So how do we interpret, how do we understand what's happening when we think that the AI system is engaging in legal interpretation? So what we know is that there are these seemingly useful outputs, but we do not know as yet, and there is no indication so far in the literature, as far as my research tells, no indication in the, I should say, in the English language literature, because that is a big caveat to my research project. I am carrying out research in English-speaking debates only, and so one of the things that I would be also pleased to hear from the audience and throughout the year is that maybe there is some ongoing research, maybe in Italian or in other languages, and I'm alive to the limitation to my project. But there is no clear methodological framework existing out there in the scholarship that would explain what's going on under the hood, so that we can legitimately describe what's happening as a legal interpretation. And so these interpretive steps and those AI agents, and remember the experiment, so the best we can say so far is that we just ascribe to those interpretive steps to the AI agent, but we do not have any forensic approaches, forensic evidence, and not even some conceptual evidence to explain why and that this actually would be an interpretive step. So to put it in more simpler terms and to rely on the very broad literature in AI explainability and interpretability, this boils down to the black box issue that if we do not know what's going on inside the model, then it's impossible to explain something with certainty that it would be legal interpretation what is going on inside. There has been some attempts in the literature to try explain what's going on inside through focusing on the chain of thought reasoning approaches. And so I'm again sure that everyone in the room is familiar with this technique, but or I will assume that everyone is familiar with the technique. But the key here is that chain of thought reasoning approaches would simply be an approximation of the inner workings. It does not explain the mechanistic steps involved in what's happening in the algorithm. So if you put in a prompt to a language model, and if the language model on the back end would generate a set of what seems to be reasoning steps, and those reasoning steps is what would then be processed further within the language model, that still doesn't tell us what's happening inside the model. So it's still simply an approximation from the outside, and so it can't be taken at face value that the chain of thought reasoning itself is legal interpretation. And again, this is actually something not that new in the scholarship, and this is something that the already referenced paper by Grimmerman and others observed too, that there is this gap in the methodological legitimacy of these approaches, that the proponents of generative interpretation or generative misinterpretation, those who try to advocate that this is a good approach, they actually did not yet haven't shown us as yet how it is that it would be methodologically legitimate to rely on those outputs. Yes, we as users of those outputs can immediately see whether the output is useful or not, but it is a different kind of thing that might be some kind of social legitimacy involved here, and that's so those highlighted words is that there's a problem with the methodological and social legitimacy. And so as they put it in their own words, the last sentence here is that the LLM proponents do not yet have a plausible story of what that something more, this something more like a legal interpretation, what that something more comprises. Now, what I focus on in this project is precisely this. So I tried to come up with so far a theory and later empirical verification, or maybe only falsification, we'll see where it goes, of this positive side of the story. So I tried to provide an approach that looks at how large language models operate from a mechanistic viewpoint. So I rely on the scholarship in mechanistic interpretability. So those of you who are not familiar, so there's a subfield of research within explainable artificial intelligence that aims to understand the internal workings of neural networks by analyzing their mechanisms present in the computation. So I try to leverage these mechanistic elements of what's going on inside large language models in order to construe this positive story of why we can, in the strong sense, why we can methodologically rely on the outputs produced by large language models as something that is useful and reliable piece of legal interpretation task. So what are the relevant mechanistic features of generative AI and large language models more broadly. So there's no time to go into this in detail, but in a nutshell, the key features I focus on is the word-to-vec embedding, so the representation of words and their relations within the within language as vectors. The transformers architecture of large language models for generative AI, which allow us to focus not only on well, to capture the context, so to speak. Again, I'm not going to explore that in greater detail right now, and I'm happy to return that in a discussion, but that's this, another important feature. So focusing on the context for the purposes of predicting what may come next within the context of the observed tokens. The parallel predictions of human-like text, so the ability of these models to, in parallel, predict different kinds of words or the next tokens that may come based on their probability value, and that is the key or one of the most important features here is the probability prediction, the prediction of what may come next based on how probable that next token in a sequence would be. Now, so what would that mean with regard to probabilistic interpretation? And here comes an attempt to give a positive definition or positive constructive definition. So that would be the processing of text with the aim to ascertain its meaning by mapping these mechanistic features of some original text, somehow represented in the foundation language model, onto the interpretive counterpart. So just to visualize it somewhat, so that would be the original text, which can be embedded and represented as being a set of embedded vectors and tokens in the text in the language, and the proposed interpretation of the original text, also embedded, also represented as a set of these features, and we would be comparing the original with the proposed interpretation. And the important thing here is that I'll get to that in the next slide. So this is actually something that we already know exists out there in terms of the mapping of one language to another. So according to some research, is actually the original purpose for these large language models would be translation from one language to another, and which would be based precisely on the similarity of embeddings of meanings in one language into another language. And so the idea is very similar, much like we translate from, let's say, English to Italian based on these embeddings and probabilities of the distribution of those words and the next word in the language. So the same thing would be here, but it would be within the same language. So it would be saying, how can we map one expression onto another expression, and what's the probability that the other expression in the same language is closely related to the original. Yeah, so that this would be about giving this proposed interpretation, and so it would be the probability of the proposed interpretation and its probabilistic link to the original. So it would be a kind of statistical closeness of the competing interpretations in the same language with the original. This is an important part, so I just want to make sure, is that clear? Yeah. Now, one thing we need to ask here is that, so how is this different from generative interpretation and from corpus linguistics, which are existing approaches out there, while generative interpretation being the emerging approach out there, corpus linguistics being the very well-established field out there. So what I would say here, and I should warn that these are tentative findings and so my current thoughts about the project. So the way this probabilistic interpretation differs from generative interpretation, importantly, is that the generative interpretation would be a process in distant writing and reading or bulk processing, where effectively, much like in the casino economics, you just put a prompt, hit generate, and wait for the answer. Whereas in what I propose here as a probabilistic interpretation is that you'd come up with an interpretation, you'd know in the original, and you would simply be asking about the probabilistic weights and the probabilistic values for the competing interpretation. So you're not asking the system or using the system in order to generate something. You are simply using the system's underlying mechanistic features in order to shed light on the probabilistic relations between those speech part or the textual parts that you are proposing. So it's a very different approach, and it's not an exercise in distant reading or bulk reading of the text, unlike generative interpretation. With corpus linguistics, I'm not sure where to put it. So obviously the approach here is very different, and the traditional techniques in corpus linguistics would be also based on some, well, not on some, but it would be based on statistical patterns in language. But the way how the corpora of language for this purpose are being created and analyzed are slightly different. So it's similar in that I'm trying to come up here with a methodical step-by-step approach or recipe how to leverage some insights about the language that we can gain through large language models. But it's different in that I'm not looking at this as trying to generate insights about corpora of legal texts, which have been curated alongside the traditional discipline of corpus linguistics. I've tried to, and I'm not an expert in corpus linguistics, I should say, I've tried to do some research on what's been published about the deployment of and the blend between large language models and corpus linguistics techniques. And I have not been able to find anything that would say that there would be a similar approach to what I'm proposing here. But I'm be very pleased to be proven wrong on that aspect. And I know that there are many experts on corpus linguistics and related techniques here. And so here I just list a couple of projects from the past I know have taken place here at the Institute, and which I think will be relevant to my project as well. So getting to the close of the presentation. So far, I've been talking about the probabilistic interpretation of texts, but it hasn't been specific to legal interpretation, what I've been saying so far. Actually, this is one of the downsides to my capabilities as a researcher, because I'm not fully, well, I have very, very limited understanding of general computational linguistics. And so one of the things that I should say completely transparently, very ignorant to is the existing approaches in general computational linguistics. What I'm focusing on here is the legal linguistics and the legal interpretation. And the reason why I focus on that is that there is a specific use and a specific legitimacy for the exercise here. So it is one thing to say that whether the method is methodologically legitimate. And so from what I've presented so far, let's take it that we may assume that AI systems can methodologically engage in this kind of interpretation so that it can be methodically legitimate. And this is something where I'll need to link my research with the general computational linguistics, perhaps. But the other part, and I'll do some empirical testings, I plan to do further maybe piloting of some tools for this as well later in the project. But the starting point in order to even do this empirical testing, etc., for me as a legal researcher is this social legitimacy. So I need to be certain, I think I need to first be, at least have a theory of why I should be certain that there are some good use cases in law, in legal interpretation, that there is a legitimacy for this approach, for this technique in law. Because why to have or develop a tool that I may say interprets legal language if there is no place to interpret, to implement this interpretation technique into the existing set of tools, methodical tools that the lawyers have. So those of you with legal background here in the room will know that lawyers have a range of fairly standardized, even though not exactly scientific, but fairly standardized methods how we go about legal interpretation, and if you propose an interpretation in a legal dispute to a judge. So that there are ways how we can meaningfully agree or disagree about, okay, so that is a sensible interpretation, that is a good interpretation, well, this is my historical interpretation, this is my textual interpretation, this is the purposive interpretation, and there are standardized ways how we go about doing that. Now imagine someone would say, okay, here is a generative interpretation or probabilistic legal interpretation. What do I do with it? Right? So how should the judge possibly in a dispute, how should they look at it? Is this a legitimate method? Is this an expert evidence of kind, or is this a legal argument? What is it? What's the status of this? So what, and that's boiling down to the question of social legitimacy of this approach. What place it has alongside the existing methods of legal interpretation, and whether it can be meaningfully integrated within those. And so that is part of the project that I'm working on right now. And my current thinking is that, so this is what I said, that the social legitimacy needs to precede any proof of concept experiments or prototyping. So what can be the legitimate use cases? And once we start asking that question, I think, in a sense, well, I first had a feeling that we start running in circles, because we start asking, so it would be a probability of a proposed interpretation. So remember, there is the original and there is the proposed interpretation. So it's a probability of a proposed interpretation, and now of what? Are we interpreting a word, interpreting a sentence, or a cluster of sentences? And is it an absolute probability? So I was saying, okay, so this is, I'm just making this up, 95% probability that of the original in text, 95% probability interpretation of the original text, or is it always probability relative to something? And so once we start thinking about these questions, it turns out that it is, I think, always relative to something. So even though we may have arguments in legal philosophy saying that the law should be understandable to everyone, and so the meaning of the law should therefore be somehow objective. The thing is that if we leverage these mechanistic features of large language models, then the probability will always be linked to a specific model we use. And there is, this is a no-brainer, right? So we maybe having a large language model which takes into account specialist jargon, and we may be trying to focus on the passage of time. So we may have a language model that focuses on the use of language in the 18th century Italian legal language, and some other models that focus on something different. We may link the meaning and the probabilities to the author of the text. So we may be asking questions such as, how probable is this interpretation if it were made by this judge? And so we may be starting to play with smaller language models and trying to ascertain the interpretations based on all these possibly controlled variables. And so ultimately, and this is so far still a theory, so I would say that the probability is always going to be relative to some selected model, which can be custom made for a specific interpretive task. And so if we then think systematically about these control variables, So the key that I could think of would be, so the probability of an interpretation can be ascertained relative to how the language, or how that language model itself, so how the language is used either by everyone in a given language, but there are problems with conceptual problems with things like, oh, what do we mean by the language there? What makes a language model a good representation of the language? The second variable might be by everyone in a given language in a certain period of history, or by people, how they use the language in a given legal system, or specific judge, or contractual party, etc. So things I've mentioned already. But importantly, and so that's the important message here, this line of inquiry, and remember that this is a legal, philosophical, theoretical line of inquiry at this point. So it throws us back to the methodological legitimacy. So interesting that trying to find a social legitimacy of the method. I try to unpack what that could mean and what we would expect of this technique in terms of how it can be used. And I figure out that we need to use it by saying, okay, so this is a probabilistic probable interpretation. This is the probability, the weight of probability relative to some language model, relative to another language model, relative to another language model. And so we start asking again questions around the methodological legitimacy. So how do we ensure that the interpretive question we ask in the first instance, so when we compare the proposed interpretation with the original, so how do we make sure that the technique that we used on the back end, that it is legitimate? And that is, again, a methodological legitimacy. So that there is an interesting, that's why I said at the beginning that it feels like running in circles, unless, and so that is where I'll finish the talk in a second. So unless we are ready to admit that this probabilistic legal interpretation is really a method of its own. And so my tentative conclusion there is that if it is a method of its own, it can't be justified at the same level as the existing interpretation methods, such as historical, purposive, or literal interpretation, because those control variables that I mentioned, those alternatives, when we say, okay, so what is the, how probable is this interpretation relative to the use of language in this period in history? Or how probable is this interpretation relative to what everyone in the language thinks? So these questions, which we may ask, and which we would be asking about their methodological legitimacy, it seems to me that it's best to understand them as effectively versions of traditional questions of legal interpretation. So the historical interpretive question, because we would be asking about the historical, even though probabilistically, historical meaning of the text. So we'll be trying to doing the same thing, the historical purposive interpretation or literal interpretation. So we'll be trying to doing the same thing through a different technique. So that is not a social legitimacy of its own. But what we can be doing there is that to look at this these probability values and to say that the probabilistic legal interpretation approach is actually an evaluative framework. So in the end, so far, where I stand right now with this project is that on the theoretical side, that the theory of probabilistic legal interpretation is not a theory of legal interpretation, but it is a theory of evaluation of legal interpretations. And it is an important shift. It has still its social legitimacy, but the social legitimacy in law of that technique would be that this is something that we can use in order to theological. I got the very apt feedback. So it would be a different, because it would be an approach to evaluating, so a methodical approach to evaluate competing interpretations. So it would not be an interpretation of its own. And that, I think, so far is the positive story developing here. And the positive story we can say is that, so it's generative interpretation, or however we want to call it, that is not the approach. I think the right approach and the methodical approach is by leveraging this mechanistic feature and by engaging in probabilistic interpretation as an evaluative approach, where we say, okay, we have a rigorous approach to ranking competing interpretations, and it can be historical interpretations, it can be purposive interpretations, it can be different types of interpretations, but this is simply an evaluation technique. So it is not a legal interpretation in its own right. So that's where I stand so far, and I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and comments. So thank you everyone for your attention.